there! Welcome back to another episode of CUPEcast. Are you hoping to learn more about unions or progressive movements? Then you're in the right spot. I'm Brittany Nisbet, and I use she and her pronouns.
And I'm Brianna Plummer. I use she, her pronouns, reminding you that we're the only podcast of our kind, combining union info, pop culture, and more, kicking ass for the working class, one podcast at a time. Whether you're a member of CUPE, in a union, wish you were in a union, or just found us while browsing, you are definitely in the right place. To hear more episodes, look for CUPEcast anywhere you stream or download podcasts. And for more feedback for future episode ideas, don't forget you can email cupecast@cupe.on.ca. That is CUPECAST@cupe.on.ca.
So, you've probably heard the saying, mental health is health. And did you know that in any given year, 1 in 5 Canadians experience a mental health issue or illness? So, the impacts of mental health affect all of us, from our workplaces to our communities. In this episode, we will discuss how mental health is a health and safety issue, how it shows up in society and workplaces, and what you can do to ensure your mental health does not affect your overall health. We will also be joined by CUPE National Representative Andréane Chénier, who will be bringing a CUPE perspective to this issue.
Yes, we cover this and so much more. So today, join us and listen to CUPEcast episode 36, Unmasking Mental Health. I want to start the episode by recognizing that we are talking about mental health, and we know that it could be a challenging topic for some of our listeners to sit through. Our intent of the episode is to bring awareness about how mental health is a health and safety issue and how it shows up in our workplaces, pop culture, and communities. If you or someone you know is impacted by this episode, there are resources available for you. We'll ensure that we provide them in our show notes. On that note, we have a lot to cover today. Mental health is such a huge topic, and it has really gained more and more importance and attention over the last few years.
Totally. And I don't remember it being this big of a topic even like
Yeah.
a decade ago.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm happy to see it discussed more. Like the only thing that I remember was when I was like a preteen age and I was in school. Every so often my mom would pull me out for the day and she would say, "Oh, you're having a mental health day." And so we would just like rest, relax, go for lunch, shop, whatever. And this was like, I'm going to age myself. This was like 15 to 20 years ago. But aside from that, like I really don't remember anyone else talking about it. I don't remember it being a hot topic. I don't remember talking about it in school. I just remember having been told, "Oh, we're going to take a mental health day today."
That is so awesome of your mom, and it's so neat that she did that. And what a great way to learn like about taking care of yourself, especially as a preteen.
Yeah, right. Like it definitely helped me to identify when I needed to take a break because she was the one that would notice, like, oh, Brittany's like, she would notice certain things, I guess, that like parents notice of their children. And she was just like, Brittany needs a break. And so it taught me how to notice to take a break.
Yeah.
But yeah, it never was something like I had never heard any of my like peers talking about mental health. I never heard any of my teachers talking about mental health. I don't think I ever heard it brought up in any other circumstance.
Yeah. And I think as well as workers working in a, capitalist society,
Yeah.
like we're always encouraged to like keep working, keep hustling to like make that buck, to make that dollar.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't even recognize when we're actually experiencing burnout to the point where our mental health is even impacted. And I just think about myself, like even a few years ago, like in the workplace, there was a certain point where like I would put in my vacation request and be like, yeah, I'm at my burnt out point. Like I need to like take a break. And I just noticed like there were like periods of the year where like I would have a burnout point and I just needed to take vacation. So kudos to your mom for allowing you to like recognize that from a young age, because even adults, we struggle to recognize when we need to take a mental health break. And so I feel like, mental health is being brought up into the limelight a lot more, particularly even past like through the pandemic. So according to Stats Canada, there's an article titled Mental Health of Canadians, It Matters. In 2022, more than 5 million people in Canada, which is probably about 1 in 5, 1 in 6 at this point,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
met the diagnostic criteria for mood, anxiety, or substance abuse disorder. And with the prevalence of mood and anxiety disorders increasing over the past 10 years.
Yeah, wow. Like
Yeah.
with that like increase, you can see exactly why it's become such a big topic of discussion and why people
Mhm.
are noticing it more and more. And I think that's this why like awareness has to come from workplaces too.
Totally agree. And CUPE National has actually have an article on their website titled Mental Health and the Well-Being at Work. So they begin with a quote from the World Health Organization. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. It is not merely the absence of disease or infirmity.
Yeah, and I love that because it's
Hmm.
so true. Like being healthy is not just physical. It's not just like, a physical thing. It's mental as well. And that article is great, and I encourage all of our listeners to check it out because it can also help you identify signs and symptoms that there may be a decline in your mental health or a friend or a coworker or a family member and you may not even realize. So it says you might see changes in your eating or sleeping habits, withdrawal or isolation, sudden or unexpected change in alcohol or drug use, changes in personal appearance, changes in energy, social ability, physical health or behavior, loss of focus or productivity, frequent absences, errors or accidents on the job, and talking about strange ideas. So that's quite the list.
It is. And something that is very important to note, and is discussed more in this article, is that if you're noticing this of a coworker, you should be supportive and non-judgmental. This leads to a more open conversation about how mental health is a health and safety issue.
Absolutely. And there can be hazards within the workplace that are causing a problem. So like, for example, I work in group homes. I work with
Hmm.
people and so, there are some houses where the people that we support are a little bit more challenging than others or have different challenges. And they, just like all of us, can have bad days, but sometimes there's someone, perhaps, I'm just using this example, this may not actually happen,
Yeah,
but they're like always swearing at you or they're always calling you names. And so, like, that is something that could be a health and safety issue because, if you're constantly going to work and you're constantly being called names, then it's going
yeah,
to take a toll on you. And there was even some examples in like throughout some like other articles that I read. Um, so it's like even if you could work in like a toxic work environment.
yeah. Yeah, and toxic work environments eventually does take a toll on your mental
Mm-hmm.
health and sometimes even your physical health. At just some point, just constantly being in that environment, it
Mm-hmm.
like you take it home with you, and you don't realize
Mm-hmm.
sometimes like how it plays out. Like you're at
Mm-hmm.
work, you're doing your thing, and then all of a sudden, you're sick or you feel
Mm-hmm.
like you're not being as productive, and sometimes it's a
Mm-hmm.
result of the environment that you're in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And toxic environment plays a factor for sure. There's a CUPE national article titled "Healthier Work, Not Tougher Workers," outlines some of the toxic work that could be things like absenteeism, high staff turnover, multiple leaves, difficulty hiring and retaining new hires, reliance on casual or temp staff, and even the increase of musculoskeletal injuries. Which,
And
with one point, Brittany, like
no, go ahead.
some of these points are like some of the reasons like we continue to advocate for better working conditions. Like if
Mm-hmm.
you see a lot of the CUPE Ontario campaigns that are happening or CUPE national campaigns that are happening, a lot of these points are highlighted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And like when you're reading that list over, I was like, oh,
Yeah.
this this might be my workplace. I'm like check off the box. I'm like, I see that one, I see that one,
Yeah.
I see that one, I see that one. And like my local's in bargaining right now and I can't get into that, but there are ways to try and make some changes. But I really found the musculoskeletal injury part super interesting too. Um and I know we'll be talking about that in a little bit, but that one I
Yeah.
think was the most interesting because when I think of mental health, I always just think of like my brain. I don't think of like the other injuries that can occur within my body because of like a not safe workplace in the sense of like mental health.
Yeah, and
So
yeah, go ahead.
no, and so I was just gonna say, like, I wonder, like, I was listening to all those, and I was like, oh, that's my workplace, that's my workplace. But like, I wonder how many of our listeners just realized that their workplace could be toxic too.
Yeah.
Crazy.
And it's prevalent in all our sectors, and it shows up
Hmm.
in different ways. So we do want to
Absolutely.
recognize that. Yeah.
Hmm.
And because, toxic workplaces have an effect on, you know, our mental health, it also affects the stress on our body. And our guest speaker today will touch a bit more on this. So look forward to the interview. So
Hmm.
we're not going to get too deep into it because we're going to leave space for our guests to talk about it. But we just want to generally say that, work stress can cause muscle tension, which eventually could cause workplace injuries.
Hmm. Yeah. And all of those examples that were listed earlier are reasons as to why we really need to focus on a psychosocial approach
Hmm.
and why employers need to as well. So that's kind of what I was referencing when I was saying, there are things you can do during bargaining to try and get employers to realize it's important to do a psychosocial approach. And so, according to that same article, a psychosocial approach recognizes that work has an impact on our mental health, and it looks at ways to eliminate mental health hazards at work that harm the workers. So it means that we really look at ways to make the workplaces better instead of making the workers tougher.
Exactly. And just an expert from the article, it says, quote, a psychosocial approach looks at how work organization and culture impact mental health. It looks for features of work that could injure workers or make them sick. Features of work that could injure mental health are called psychosocial hazards, end quote. Which is really why mental health is a health and safety issue.
Yeah, that's really how it boils down. You're right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, we also know that mental health is an ongoing theme that's been highlighted in pop culture and literature. And as we mentioned earlier, conversations around mental health have really shifted in the recent years. Like how it's represented, like TV shows and books and music over the decades, has really changed.
Hmm.
It shows how far we've come in terms of language and representation, but we know that it also shows how far we still need to go.
Yes. So for our listeners today, I want to reference a 2020 Vogue article called Bunny Boiler Stigma to Brave Storytelling, a timeline of mental health narratives in pop culture. I know that's a mouthful.
I was gonna say
Um,
that's a long title.
it is. The article is written by Oliver Loon. Just a quick summary of the article. So Loon noted that representation of mental health in the early to mid 20th century was not as nuanced. So he stated that in media, quote, crazy was crazy, sane was sane. There was also
Mhm.
terms that were used to describe people battling with mental health issues. I don't want to say it on the podcast,
No, yeah, no.
but needless to say, media didn't offer an opportunity at the time to dig deeper into the history of the character and into insight of why these challenges exist and why they're battling with mental health issues.
Mhm.
Has stated it's only been in recent years, and we've been reinforcing this, that we are seeing more of an in-depth conversation about mental health. Shows like Netflix, 13 Reasons Why. I don't know if you heard of that show, Brittany.
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah, which explores like conversations of suicide and health harm, and it actually like does the character development of the
Mhm.
individual who's going through this.
So I think 13 Reasons Why was originally a book.
Okay.
I think, if I'm remembering correctly, but I have mom brain right now. So I don't remember everything. There's also another book, like when you were talking, that I thought about too. It's called, if I'm remembering correctly, it's called Go Ask Alice. And it
Okay.
also talks about, it shows the character having like a mental health decline and then beginning to start using drugs and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, but that 13 Reasons Why is a great example. Um, and when I think of like literature or other childhood shows, I think of like Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah.
Um, I love Winnie the Pooh. um, I've always loved Winnie the Pooh. So I have like the original books, and it's a whole thing. But
Yeah.
for our listeners who may not know about Winnie the Pooh, it was a series created by A. Milne. It's about a teddy bear and his friends who have adventures in Hundred Acre Wood, and like the bear is, like, just some background. Like the bear is actually based off of a real bear,
Yeah.
and the real bear's name was Winnie, and she was in Winnipeg, so it's kind of got a Canadian background. But for many children, the characters from the stories teach us many lessons throughout their adventures.
Yes, and I also love Winnie the Pooh and have grown up reading the stories and watching multiple series that have showed
They're
up on
so just
television.
wholesome. They're
They
just so
are,
wholesome.
yes. And we want to note that these characters and the series and the concept of Winnie the Pooh was created in the 1920s. But in more recent years, there's been a clinical lens that's been applied to the characters and how these characters may portray mental health struggles. So this concept first arose in 2000 when Dr. Sarah Chénier and her team released an article or journal article called Pathology in the Hundred Acre Wood, a neurodevelopmental perspective of AA mailing. While we cannot access the full journal article because you probably have to pay for it, there is an abstract that's
Damn
available.
paywalls.
I know there's an abstract that's available online, and it does have a table. So it does include the table that highlights the diagnosis of the characters based on their behaviors and characteristics. I will link that to the website, and it will be available in our show notes.
Yeah, and so for our listeners, we'll also share a Medium article titled Winnie the Pooh, A Mental Health Look by Kushak M, who also highlights some of the mental health conditions that these characters experience. So in the article, Kushik states, acknowledging that A.A. Milne's classic stories weren't intended to be clinical diagnostic tools. However, several characters exhibit quirks and behaviors that, through the lens of modern psychology, resonate with various mental conditions. And so we'll quickly highlight some of the characters. We won't be highlighting all of them, of course. We'll leave the links, like Brand has mentioned, in our show notes. But for today, we'll look at Winnie and we'll look at Piglet.
Yeah, so let's start with the main protagonist, Winnie. So Winnie's character, so according to clinicians, is embodiment of ADHD and OCD based on his impulsive behavior, his challenge to focus, and his repetitive behavior in terms of when he's counting. Clinicians also noted that Winnie has a fixation on honey. If you read the books, we all know Winnie loves his honey. But this could also be a reflection of an eating disorder because Winnie uses honey as a form of a coping mechanism. Next on our list, and I feel so bad because I know some of us love these characters and just like tear them down and to analyze them.
I'm still gonna love it. Don't
yes,
worry.
Yes, me too.
I'm still gonna love it.
Yes. So the second character on the list is Piglet. So we all know that Piglet is known to be shy and timid and often depends on Winnie and the other characters for reassurance. But according to the clinical diagnosis, Piglet would be diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, also known as GAD, based on his constant worrying and his fears.
Oh.
I know. This is only two. Like, there's a list for all of them.
Oh, we didn't even touch on Eeyore.
Yeah. Or Tigger.
Or Tigger. I don't even think we need to touch on Eeyore. But while Kushik has noted that these are not definitive diagnoses of the characters, exploring the parallels between fictional characters and mental health really opens up important conversations about mental health. Yes,
and we just talked about fictional characters, but we also know celebrities are often battling mental health issues.
Mm-hmm.
And the sad thing about this is that sometimes their mental health issues and what they're battling with is thrusted into the limelight, and at times it's packaged up for our entertainment. And there are many examples of celebrities, the Britney Spears, the Heath Ledger, the Selena Gomez, the Demi Lovato. Like, we know there are a lot of celebrities who have battled mental health issues over the years. But I do want to bring up a recent documentary series called Quiet on Set, The Dark Side of Kids TV. Have you heard of this series, Brittany?
So I've heard of it, but I never watched it. Like, I know that it exists out there. However, since we're quickly touching on series, Demi Lovato, because you mentioned her, she did a 4-part series, I think, and I'm pretty sure you can watch on like YouTube. I think it might be 6 parts, but it details like her decline in mental health as well, and drug addiction and drug abuse and alcohol addiction, and how she overcame all of that. So just gonna put a plug for that if you are interested in watching, it's actually a really good watch. And like how she rediscovers herself. It's got a brilliant ending. I mean, it's obviously not ended. Demi Lovato is still an amazing star, but yeah. So no, I've never watched Quiet on Set, but I've heard of it. I don't know if I want to watch it.
I have not watched. Yeah. Go ahead, finish your thought.
Oh, I would say I don't really know if I wanna, like, I don't know. There are some things like, how we were just going through, like, Winnie the Pooh. I'm like, "This makes me sad." I don't know if I
Y-
wanna be sad anymore.
yes. So this docu-series might be heartbreaking for a lot of our millennial and Gen Z listeners, because this could actually change the way you view your favorite Nickelodeon show. So myself, Brittany, like we grew up
Yeah.
watching some Nickelodeon shows, particularly ones in the late 90s and the early 2000s.
Mhm.
But a quick summary about the docuseries. It's a four-part docuseries that highlights the working conditions of some of the Nickelodeon shows that aired in the 1900s, not 1900s, the 1990s
It's
and
like,
the
"Do
early
not tell
2000s.
them, 1900s."
The 1990s and early 2000s. So it does touches on themes of abuse, racism, sexism, and how it impacted the physical and mental well-being of child actors on set. This documentary is a reminder that the protection of child actors and their mental well-being should be at the forefront. We could probably do a whole episode
Oh.
on child actors and
Oh.
working conditions.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that could be a whole episode on itself.
I
Yes.
gotta write that
So
down.
we will say that, these are allegations that were put forward, and they do have some of the actors who were on Nickelodeon shows during the late 1990s and the early 2000s who kind of shared their testimonials and their experiences.
Mhm. And we know when mental health is not protected, it does have an impact on workers. And so, like you mentioned, this documentary shows that there are toxic work environments that were happening on these sets, and they had a negative impact on the child workers. So, for example, some of our listeners might remember Drake Bell. He has said that the abuse that he experienced from one of the producers at Nickelodeon, actually, he ended up turning to drugs and alcohol as coping mechanisms. And if folks have followed his career, you know that he eventually was arrested for a DUI and abuse in the past,
Yeah. And
which
that's
is
just one story, right?
yeah.
And
Oh, absolutely.
we know, like, if you follow some of the Nickelodeon's child stars that are now adults, and if you see like some of the patterns and some of the experiences, you might
Mhm.
be able to make a connection. Um,
Mhm.
they haven't outright put the two and two together. Drake has said it, but not all actors have said it. But
Mhm.
just you could probably see that pattern,
Mhm.
which is sad and unfortunate. So
Mhm.
beyond Hollywood, we know that the impacts of unsafe work environments and the lack of investments towards care and mental health will have an impact on workers and our society overall.
And the sad part is that we're continuously seeing cuts to programs and initiatives that actually support folks.
Yeah.
So like an example of this is Bill 166, the Strengthening Accountability and Student Support Act that the Ford government has put forward. So for our listeners who may not know what Bill 166 is, if it passes, it will give the provincial government power over anti-racism and mental health policies at educational institutions, which is insane.
Yes. This is just new. So this just come out very recently. So just to kind of highlight some of the reasons why the Ford government is putting this forward. The Ford government stated that the legislation is intended to address the rise of racism on campuses, maintain safety and support for post-secondary students, and standardize mental health policies across the province. However, many professors across the province have spoken out against this bill. In a
Mhm.
CBC article titled "Profs Call Ford Government Bill Political Interference on Campus," highlight some
Mhm.
of the reactions from these groups who oppose the bills. So
Mhm.
the posers note that Bill 166 will undermine the autonomy at universities and take away the ability to tailor and address the needs of the student and staff
Mhm.
body. So we
Mhm.
all know that, each campus and each staff and student body looks different. So you
Yeah.
need to address the needs based on your population. So it
Mhm.
can't always be standardized because it will look
No.
different. Yeah,
Yeah.
depending where you live and which school. And, as they noted in this article as well, that, the Ford government also disbanded advisory committees. So once they came into
Mhm.
power, that had
Mhm.
focused on anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, and anti-Indigenous racism, which, in turn will only negatively impact these groups who experience this as well.
Yeah. Mhm.
So as we mentioned, this bill is just been put forward. It is an ongoing story. There are conversations that are happening around this. So we'll see how this plays out at Queen's Park.
Mm-hmm. And Bill 166 is just an example of how things can create negative impacts. So, according to the Canadian Mental Health Association, they note some examples of mental illness impacts in the workplace, and some include, but are not limited to, absenteeism or sick days, presenteeism, which is interesting because that's a worker coming to work but not being able to function, disability, reduced engagement, and work performance. The article is from 2016, but it really includes some relevant information and shows how mental illness shows up in the workplace and how we as workers can support each other. So, as usual, if you want to check it out, it'll be in our show notes.
Yeah. And some of the examples that Brittany just highlighted, we said at the top of the episode, but it's just a constant reminder that, it continues to impact the way we function in our workplaces. So our guest today also had a really great presentation deck about connecting work and mental health that is also available online. So we also are going to share this presentation. So please look out for it in our show notes. And I'm sure it will be a really great reference for our listeners.
Oh, it's fabulous. And we have covered a lot. Just Brianna and I alone have covered a lot. And I don't want to take up too much more time because we do still have our interview with Andy. But I do want to mention to you all that May 6th to 12th is Mental Health Week. And so this week's theme is a call to be kind.
And there's even a hashtag. It is hashtag Compassion Connects. And on the Canadian Mental Health Association website, a quick description of this year's theme says, "We have the capacity to be compassionate, and we know that doing so can make an enormous difference. This year's Mental Health Week is centered on healing power of compassion. In a world plagued by suffering, we emphasize that kindness is equally intrinsic to our humanity. Join us from May 6th to 12th, 2024 to explore how compassion connects us all."
And they also have a toolkit, which is super cool. So you can check it out on their website. It has social media graphics, there's banners, there's posters, and then there's a bunch of resources all developed by the Canadian Mental Health Association, also known as CMHA, like what is compassion, the mental health impacts of compassion, how to create a compassionate work culture, which could be really cool with if you're going into bargaining, because this also goes along with creating a less toxic work environment. And then there's a super neat week-long journaling activity.
So we highly suggest that you take a look at the website and consider bringing it to your local or workplaces, or even just journaling yourself. It could be a really great exercise. Everything that we have referenced today will be in our show notes, so please make sure to check them out. But I do think now is the perfect time to go to our interview. So I hope our listeners enjoy it. We are so excited to have Sister Chénier joining us today. She's also known by Andréane Chénier, and she's a CUPE national representative specializing in health and safety. She assisted CUPE members in Ontario with a wide range of occupational health and safety issues, ranging from workplace violence and harassment to working alone, shift work, joint health and safety committees, and psychosocial hazards. She is a certified instructor for mental health first aid and for the Workers' Health and Safety Center, and is a trained neutral third party for conflict resolution. Andy has presented the public sector worker perspective as a representative on many committees, including the Ministry of Labor's Provincial Council, as the Labor co-chair on the Section 21 Committee for Healthcare, and as a member or director on various boards and committees of health and safety organizations. She has participated in research, writing, and publication of health and safety tools to help workers find answers to their workplace problems. Prior to her work as a health and safety specialist, she was a scientific researcher working in biological safety, level 3 laboratory in the health sciences fields of HIV, immunology, and cancer metabolism. A published author, presented her research at provincial, national, and international conferences. She holds a bachelor's degree in biochemistry and a master's degree in microbiology and immunology from the University of Ottawa, and a doctorate in biomolecular sciences from Laurentian University. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. You have done a lot just reading your bio. You have accomplished a lot. Um, so let's jump in with our questions. So our first question for you, how can members use the Health and Safety Act to advocate for better mental health support in the workplace?
Great question. And first, I want to start by saying that we're at an interesting position in time. So when you start looking at the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Occupational Health and Safety Act has a general duty clause. And that general duty clause, you'll find it in section 25(2)(h). And basically what it says is that the employer has a responsibility to take all reasonable precautions for the protection of a worker. And everywhere throughout the act, you're going to see references to the health or the safety of workers. But one of the things that you will not find is an actual limitation saying that the only things that are going to be considered are going to be the physical health of an individual. And I don't know about you, but I've never actually seen a person who could, go about their day and, successfully accomplish tasks when their heads are attached to the rest of their bodies. And so I don't understand how the Ministry of Labor is taking a position right now that the Occupational Health and Safety Act doesn't actually think about mental health and mental well-being of workers. And it's an interesting position that they're taking right now. And they're saying what they are saying is that the act doesn't really contemplate those kinds of things. And yet, here's the interesting part in time that where we are in time. The same ministry that tells us that the health and safety of workers isn't contemplated in the safety part will also compensate for occupationally acquired illnesses like post-traumatic stress disorder, which tells us that, in fact, they do, contemplate the mental health and well-being of workers. And if you can compensate through WSIB, through the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act, Board, and through the Act, what that tells me is that there is a link to the workplace. Also very interesting is the fact that the ministry is currently funding some research programs to deal with occupational diseases, and part of those are the mental health research programs. So that's an interesting place is whereas on the prevention side, the employer says you don't really have to do anything. Whereas on the flip side, on the compensation side, they're saying absolutely an employer is responsible for dealing with the health outcomes of workers when it happens at work. The link that we're sort of missing right now is for the Ministry of Labor to simply acknowledge that health is a full body situation. And so that we cannot divorce our mental health or our mental well-being from our physical health and our physical well-being, that they're all interconnected. And so when we're talking about the Occupational Health and Safety Act, does the Occupational Health and Safety Act contemplate that? I would say absolutely it does. And it does in a couple of different places. First off, it'll tell you that the employer has an obligation to deal with workplace harassment. And what we do know about workplace harassment is that the impacts are all psychological in nature. And when the employer fails to do that, then you can absolutely be compensated for chronic mental stress. Again, through the compensation board. So if there's workplace harassment, entirely psychological, the employer has an obligation to take reasonable steps there too. And in the Occupational Health and Safety Act, you'll see that show up in sections, in the section 32.0. In 32.0.1, there's an obligation to have a policy to address things like work-related harassment. And there's also an obligation to have an entire procedure that happens after the fact, where you're going to be talking about, investigation procedures. You need to have a program. You have to have a way to start responding to complaints, that you need to have appropriate reporting mechanisms. So from the concept of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, from a labor perspective, absolutely the Occupational Health and Safety Act covers mental well-being. Because from our position, or from our perspective, that position is one that is necessary because we cannot divorce physical health from mental health.
Wow, that was such a good answer.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. That's amazing. And it's wonderful that our listeners can learn all of this from you. So thank you so much. There are different categories of violence. So those include like physical violence, verbal violence, which could also include hate speech, psychological violence, sexual violence, and socioeconomic violence. Would you be able to take a few minutes to speak to the relationship between violence and mental health?
Absolutely. So violence is one of those unpredictable situations that workers, especially workers in the public sector, are and workers on the front line have to deal with on a regular basis. And the unfortunate reality is that as frontline workers and more precisely as care providers or as service providers, you're much more likely to experience violence from the people you provide care or service to than you are from any other group that you might interact with. That overwhelmingly, like way more than the members of the general public, way more than your coworkers or the fourth category of violence that is contemplated under the Occupational Health and Safety Act is intimate partner violence or domestic violence, as it's referred to in the Act. So what is the link between violence and with mental health and well-being? The problem there is that when workers are exposed to violence on a regular basis, what's happening is you eventually get to a point where you either exceed your capacity to cope with a situation, or on the flip side, you become so immune to it that you fail to respond to what would be normal situations. So when we talk about those kinds of situations, what we're talking about is a critical incident. So in a nutshell, what is a critical incident? A critical incident is a situation that causes a very strong negative reaction in the individual that's subjected to the incident. And generally, strong negative reaction is going to happen because the people were not adequately prepared to deal with the situation.
Mm.
So think about our workplaces, think about CUPE workplaces. Do we always have the right amount of people, like staff members, to be able to adequately respond to an incident of violence when it happens? Does everybody have the right training? Do we all have tools? Does everybody feel safe when they're at work? Because all of those things are factors that are going to determine whether or not a situation is going to go well or not. And in situations where workers feel like they don't have mastery over a situation, they're much more likely to get into situations where they're not sure what to do, or where they're not necessarily sure that there's going to be a safe response to the thing that's happening in front of you. And even when there is, for example, there's an incident of violence, it was pretty bad, lots of people responded, the situation was handled according to procedure, but this worker was still impacted. It still had really strong feelings about what happened. If there's not enough space and time after the incident for a worker to be able to deal with what happened. So what we're thinking about, think about, is there a critical incident briefing? Is there an opportunity for workers to actually make sense of what happened, why things happened, how things happened, how they should have happened, and so on? So if there's no opportunity for them to actually make sense of the situation, if they're basically told to, okay, now it's over, just, move along, get back to work, just, carry on. When workers don't have the right amount of time to process those things, then they internalize them. And because they haven't had a chance to deal with them and make sense of their reactions, or they're being asked to ignore them completely, then it can lead to other more difficult situations down the line. For example, a worker might then say, okay, well, am I at fault? Is this because of something that I did? Or is something wrong with me that I'm now feeling like this? Should I be able to go back to work? And so on and so forth. So all of those things, when you put them together, so exposure to unsafe situations, lack of ability to respond to a situation with mastery, not having proper response protocols for after to prevent the impact from making something worse, and no psychological supports to deal with what you do in fact have to deal with. That's a perfect situation for a worker to then have negative impact on their mental well-being. It's not to say that every critical incident is going to be an issue. But eventually, over time, there's only so much that we can put into our buckets, like the analogy of stress and our ability to cope as being a bucket, and the bucket representing the amount of challenges that you can be dealing with at any given time. If we're not actually giving workers the ability to empty out their buckets, then what's going to happen is eventually it doesn't matter what the worker is or which worker we're talking about or how strong or how anything. Eventually, you're going to overwhelm a worker. And at that point, it's a question of how bad is the flood.
Hmm.
So Andy, we're now going to just take a shift from talking about the individual to joint health and safety committees. We know many workplaces do have joint health and safety committees to support and respond to issues that might arise in the workplace. So if you could tell our listeners, what role can the joint and health safety committees play in addressing mental health issues in the workplace? And are there any opportunities for joint and health and safety committees to better advocate for better mental health supports?
Oh my God, great question. Really great question. So I see the role of a joint health and safety committee as being one of an advocacy. Basically, your entire reason for being to bring forth worker concerns and the worker experience in a neutral setting where you can have conversations with the employer about how we can improve work, because that's the whole purpose of the joint health and safety committee, is how do we improve work and how do we improve working conditions so to make them healthier and safer for the workforce in general. And like there's this interesting problem that happens in the workplace when it comes to health and safety. Employers seem to think that they're not workers, but they are in fact workers. Their mental health and well-being is being impacted by the fact that their workers don't have psychologically healthy and safe workplaces. And so when we start dealing with issues that affect workers, we're dealing with issues that affect all workers in a workplace. Because I've never seen a hazard that affects only one particular type of workers. Because at the end of the day, when it's in the workplace, if people have access, anybody who has access to a space has access to the hazard. And so like this idea that we're somehow like there's these artificial lines is not actually true. So when we start looking at how can we use the Joint Health and Safety Committee like as an advocacy tool? Well, oh my God, let's start talking about that. What should we be talking about? Let's talk about the fact that, hey, there are people that from our workplace that are currently off on sick leave. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the fact that there might be some improvements that we need to be making in our workplace violence prevention program, and that maybe what we need is when we're talking about the workplace prevention program, that we're also talking about disease mitigation after the fact. It is true that violence is going to happen because there's no way that for us to be able to completely get to a zero a place where violence will never be in our future, because violence comes from interactions with people, and violence comes from people, and we can't stop being people. Therefore, the potential for violence is always present. So in that context, if we can't say that violence is never going to come into our workplaces, that means that we have to accept that violence might just come into our workplaces and are prepared for that, not just for the initial violent event, but also for the stuff that needs to happen after the fact to prevent workers, not just from the physical injury, but from the long-term psychological impact. Because let's not kid ourselves. When workers are off on mental health related leaves, those leaves can sometimes be the more lengthy ones and the harder ones to get people reintegrated into the workplace. So some of the ways that a joint health and safety committee can be involved and to improve the well-being is to take a look at those programs that exist in a workplace. Think about programs as the how-to manual of how health and safety is supposed to happen in your workplace. Is your how-to manual, is it up to date? Do we need does it actually is it specific enough for the work reality as it is today, not as it was written probably 15, 20 years ago, but as it exists today in the workplace? Are there some things there or some places, so like say, for example, a peer support program that we might be suggesting to an employer as a way to start dealing with very lengthy to prevent actually workers from needing to take very lengthy leaves. Are there other psychological supports that we might be putting into place? Those are absolutely recommendations that could be coming from a joint health and safety committee. Just if we're looking at the work-related violence program, you could also be examining the work-related harassment program for the same reasons. Harassment happens in the workplace. You can absolutely claim. Of course, I'm not saying that it's an automatic. No claim is
Mm-hmm.
automatically no claim is automatically accepted. But if
Yeah.
you can demonstrate work-related harassment, you can get a claim accepted possibly later on down the line. So those are all a few like different ways in which joint health and safety committees and the membership on the worker side can start advocating. And the best tools we can use to advocate are knowledge transfer. So by all means, let's get educated.
Mm-hmm. No, that's
Yeah.
wonderful. That's I just want you to like keep talking. Just talk all you want because you're just like a wealth of information and I love it and I'm sure our listeners love it. Um, just on to our next question. So we know that there's intersectionality when it comes to mental health, and we know that mental health issues show up differently for different groups based on circumstances. So could you unpack, and I know this is going to be like, this is such a big question, but can you unpack for our listeners how intersectionality, such as like race, gender, and sexuality, can impact folks' mental health?
Oh yeah,
And
yeah, that
it's a
is
huge
such a great
question,
question.
a
It's a
loaded
huge
question.
question, but actually a really, really important one. And okay, so I want to start by reading to you the definition for mental health that the Public Health Agency of Canada has published on their website. And it's that mental health is the capacity of each and all of us to feel, think, and act in ways that enhance our ability to enjoy life and deal with the challenges that we face. It's a positive sense of emotional, spiritual well-being that respects the importance of culture, equity, social justice, interconnections, and personal dignity. And the reason I'm starting with that is that, like, I just really want people to think about the fact that do you actually feel like you belong somewhere if you can't be who you are? Or if there's some aspects of you as a person, as an individual, that is being othered by the people that you work with, where there's negative discourse about maybe about your cultural background, about maybe it's an accent that you have, or maybe it's your gender identity, your gender expression, like any of the basic human rights that we as Canadians and Ontarians take for granted. Those are things that actually are very, very important to a person's well-being. Because when we have these things, when our culture, when our sense of equity, social justice, our interconnection, and our personal dignity are well respected, we feel we belong. And when we belong, that's when we can actually be the most productive and the most integrated that can be in a workplace. So when we have situations where the person cannot be who they are, that will absolutely take a toll. There's a term that's used very often in the mental health and well-being. Maybe it's more mental well-being field, and we talk about masking. So people who pretend to be they are not just to gain acceptance. And that we know that masking or trying to not, not to act like you're someone else, it's a great deal of time, energy, and personal resources out of an individual. So if you're taking all of your time, energy, and concentration and trying to put it into being accepted by a group of people who inherently do not accept you, and you're taking away that time, energy, and effort and your resources towards doing something that might be more productive in terms of like producing good work, giving good service, providing excellent quality care like CUPE members provide on the regular. So
Hmm.
those are that's like it's a very part. You cannot divorce a person's being, like their mental well-being, from their physical well-being. And because you can't do that, you also cannot separate them from their identity.
Wow, that is very powerful. And that's a great way of looking at it. And I appreciate you taking the time to break that down for our listeners, particularly as we know there's been funding cuts when it comes to addressing a lot of the issues as it relates to race, gender, sexuality, that we're seeing, and those have negative impacts as well on our society. So thank you for that. Andy, you recently presented at the Health and Safety Forum a few weeks ago. So for our listeners, CUPE Ontario's Joint Health and Safety Committee hosted a Health and Safety Forum online for CUPE members. And at this forum, Andy talked about connecting work and mental health. So for our listeners, could you just highlight any trends or issues that members have brought forward at the forum?
Absolutely. So during the forum, really what we were trying to do is say, okay, so we have mental well-being on one side and we have work on the other, and what connects the two? And what the things that connect the two are psychosocial hazards. And psychosocial hazards, big word. And really what we're talking about is we're talking that work is organized, it's designed, or work is managed by your employer. So we're talking about your employer's decisions about how work is, like what the work experience is going to be like for workers. And so and because they are decisions, they can be redecided. Like just because you've organized something one way doesn't mean you can't reorganize it later. Believe me, I've reorganized my kitchen often enough to demonstrate that's totally. So, right. So but you can always move things around, right? So psychosocial hazards, that's what they are. They are hazards that exist in the work that have nothing to do with your primary job, say, for example, as a library worker, as a school board worker, as a healthcare worker, as a university worker, as a municipal worker. It has nothing to do with the specifics of your job while you were there. What it has to do is the way that, the policy stuff that your employer does about how you're going to do your job on the day-to-day. And so when you start looking at hazards in the work, that's where the Occupational Health and Safety Act comes in. If it's a hazard is just a potential for harm to workers, then that means that if there's a hazard present, then your employer has an obligation to take care of it. And so when we were talking about, as we were making these connections and just basically getting people from point A to point B to point C, that, yes, work hazard, exposure to hazard means harm to workers. A lot of people then started talking about what they were experiencing at work. And a lot, unfortunately, a lot of CUPE members are very, very, very impacted by work-related violence is the number one. And then the impact to mental well-being is the second one that we hear about. And some of the trends that we were hearing about in terms of on the mental well-being is not having, the right to psychological protection into their collective agreement, not having the right mix of interventions as part of maybe their EAP program, their benefits, which to my mind is also such a group expanding our healthcare sector to our healthcare services to include mental health care for everyone. So those were some of the things that kept coming up for workers, because I provided this particular workshop multiple times at this point, and that's the number one thing that comes across, whether it's in Ontario, whether it's in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, it doesn't matter. Most of the time, those were the concerns coming to the forefront. And I'd also like to point out that there is a legal obligation for your employer to establish psychologically safe workplaces, and that actually comes through a whole variety of different things. But it's in the occupational health and safety legislation, it's in workers' compensation legislation, it's in the law of torts. So the law of torts is kind of like the law of obligations, if you like, and one of them is that your employer doesn't have the right to be negligent in the way that they set up work. So if they know that a way that work is being set up is a problem, then they have an obligation to be reasonable and fair, and to in fact do things in that way so that it's reasonable and fair. There's also human rights legislation that says the employer doesn't have the right to discriminate against individuals who may have a disability. That includes mental health conditions. There's an obligation to accommodate when that happens in labor relations law and employment standards in Quebec, more specifically specifically. We're going to be talking about, having cause and just cause when we're going to be disciplining, or if we're going to be adding any kind of negative treatment onto workers. So there's a bunch of different places where there's a legal obligation for employers to provide psychologically safe workplaces. But the problem that we have most of the time is that people aren't really aware of what that really means or how to enact it in the workplace. So the best way we can actually do that is through education, advocacy on the parts of by the parts of unions, labor relations advocates, mental health advocates, health and safety advocates, return to work advocates. Like, so many people can actually help drive that movement forward.
Hmm. And like I have seen Andy do that presentation I think 3 times now. Because I was at both of the forums, and I think that's the same one that you did at the Health and Safety Injured Workers Conference in Windsor, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And I was like, yeah, it's always wonderful. So if you ever have a chance to see Andy present, I would highly recommend, because she does a wonderful job at not making you feel overwhelmed with all of the information, and making it easy to understand, but also like making you feel like empowered, which is wonderful and something that we need in our workplaces when we're dealing with mental health, because it's very hard.
Yeah,
Um,
agreed.
yeah. So, because I kind of know Andy a little bit, I have a feeling I already know what she's going to say for this question. But do you have any training or resources that you would recommend to our listeners, that they should take or look at in regards to mental health?
Absolutely. So, Fav, I'm going to start by saying CUPE offers several workshops in the mental health sphere. So, one of them is the Stewards Learning Series, Understanding Mental Health. There's also a workshop called Creating Psychologically Safe Workplaces. There's another workshop that's called Preventing Mental Injuries. We have and then there's other workshops that are sort of tangential. So where we're going to be talking about, there's one on the duty to accommodate. Great workshop when we're going to be talking about return to work and all of the legal obligations with returning to work after an injury, or just accommodating an individual for who they are and what they need to be able to do their work. There's also all of the social justice workshops. Any one of those will be information, because the more we understand about the reality of people who are not like us, so everybody has different lived experience. And so the more we can understand types of lived experience, the more we actually then become better advocates, because we understand better. So those are some of the CUPE workshops that you might be looking at. There's also the Workers' Health and Safety Center that has a variety of different workshops that are steeped in Ontario legislation. Highly recommend them as well. It's the Workers' Health, it's the Workers' Training Center. It's workers training workers. So you know that you're going to get a very real answer from people who are providing those kinds of workshops, because they come with a worker's experience of doing the things. And then there's also some third-party workshops that we offer. One of them is the mental health first aid. This is one of the workshops that I facilitate. I am a mental health first aid facilitator. And then there's also the assist to the applied skills in suicide intervention training, I believe. No, yeah, this is training. So advanced skills in suicide intervention. Definitely recommend any of those workshops as being opportunities for individuals to just learn a little bit more, either about mental health in the context of work, or how to be a better, gentler, more empathetic human being who might be able to assist someone while they're having a hard time.
Thank you so much, Andy, for all the information you shared today and the resources. Before we conclude this interview, is there any final words or anything you would like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, if you're interested in looking for solutions, I like to offer places where people can learn on their own that is freely accessible. So a couple of different resources that you can find on the internet, or was like the web. So one of them, and it was like the interwebs. So if you go into the Google and you type in "tracking the perfect legal storm," anybody who's interested in understanding the legal obligation of employers to establish psychologically safe workplaces, there's this fantastic document that was written by Dr. Martin Shane, fantastic human being as well. Met him many times. He's great conversations. So that's one. So you can read all about the legal framework in Canada. So this is all Canadian. So that's more important. There's also the International Labor Office that has a document called, and I always get it wrong, and I think it's Stress Prevention at Work Checkpoints. And that document is a wealth of resources, is European in nature, but a wealth of resources to look at psychosocial hazards, how to, some interventions that you might be putting in place that are pretty like honestly intuitively they're good solutions, and they're not necessarily going to be super costly. So that's another one. And then there's the Z1003. So the Z1003 is Canadian Standards Association standards. Basically what it does is it explains to employers what a psychological safety, health and safety program in work needs to have in order for it to work. Because too many times employers to give us that are come from the top down and along the lines of this one size fits all approach. And if anybody has ever tried to put on something that said one size fits all, the only thing we know is that it fits no one well.
Yeah.
It fits
Yeah.
poorly on every.
Yeah.
And so what we're looking for really is to establish the standards that come from the ground up. So we want leadership to come from the top down, but we want the programs to be informed from the bottom up. And so when you're looking at the Z1003, again, a free download from CSA Group, you will get a document that explains what those outcomes need to be. They don't tell the employer how to do the thing. It just says, if you want to do this thing, then it needs to look like this. How you get there, we don't care, but you need to get here. So those are some of the free resources that I would point workers to. In addition, if you're looking for some Ontario specific tools, you'll find some on the occupational health clinics for Ontario workers. They have a fantastic survey tool called Stress Assess, and you can find that at stressassess.ca. And some resources that you will find on the Public Services Health and Safety Association, the pshsa.ca. They also have resources available places to use.
Thank you so much.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. And I'm sure our listeners will enjoy and appreciate all the resources that you shared today. So thank you so much, Andy, for taking time out of your day to be with us on CUPEcast and sharing all the amazing information with our listeners. For our listeners, we'll be back shortly to wrap up the episode. And we're back. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning into episode 36 of CUPEcast, Unmasking Mental Health. And we want to do a big shout out to Andy Chénier for being such a dynamic guest for today's episode.
Yes, thank you, Andy. If anyone has ever had the opportunity to see Andy speak or do a presentation, you know how wonderful she is. And I mean, even just listening to her on this podcast, she was fabulous. So we did speak a lot about health and safety on this episode. So there are a few reminders that I want to give for folks who may be attending the CUPE Ontario Convention at the end of May. So I'm the co-chair of the Health and Safety Committee. And so just to let folks know, you can maybe like put it in the back of your head for later, that there will be a health and safety caucus at convention, and this is open to everybody.
Okay.
The committee will also have a space at the CUPE Ontario's committee table in the gallery. So if you've ever been to convention, that's just outside of the main convention hall. There's like a bunch of tables all set up. So there's a specific table for CUPE Ontario committee. So we'll be there. So come and say hi. We would love to chat with you all, and we'll have a lot of great handouts and resources as well that you can take back to your locals. And then also save the date, because the CUPE Ontario Health and Safety and Injured Workers Advocacy Committee Conference is scheduled for this October. So it's October 21st to 25th, and it's in Markham. And then finally, the committee will be holding their third Health and Safety Forum in June. This is held online, and again, it's open to everyone to attend. It is free. you don't have to pay for any of it, of course. And we just have wonderful discussions about health and safety issues at these forums, and we hold them on a Sunday morning and a Thursday evening, so that folks can plan. If someone has to work on like a Sunday, or you have family things on Sunday, you can make the Thursday, and if Thursday night you have to work, then you can make the Sunday. So we try to make it so that everyone can attend and it's open to everybody. So keep your eyes on CUPE Ontario's e-blasts for more info on how to register for that, because you'll be seeing that probably after convention.
Wow, that is so awesome. I'm actually looking forward to a lot of this work that the committee is doing. And your committee is really busy, the health and safety committee. So kudos to this committee, because this is very important work and very important information that all workers, all members need to know on an ongoing basis. Well, folks, that is all from us today. We hope that you enjoyed today's episode. This podcast was written and researched by Brittany and myself. We want to take a moment to thank the CUPE Ontario staff involved in this episode. Without them, this podcast would not exist. If you have future podcast ideas, please email us at cupecast@cupe.on.ca. That is CUPECAST@cupe.on.ca. And we also want to thank our friend Mohammed Akbar for being the amazing edit master. This podcast would not sound as great as it does without his talents.
Yes. And before we close out, we want to thank all of our incredible listeners for tuning into this episode. Please continue to look for us anywhere you stream or download podcasts, including Spotify, Apple, Google Podcast, or you can even check us out on the CUPE Ontario website. Please follow or subscribe. And if you listen to this on Apple or Anchor, you could write us a review. We would love to hear your thoughts about this episode. And, as always, feel free to share us with your friends or fellow members in your local. We reference our show notes a lot. They have lots of information that you can share, and we hope that you will build awareness about mental health in the workplace and in your communities. So as usual, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time. Sending solidarity.